Good afternoon, everybody. We wanted to welcome you all to this event called Belonging, the Science of Creating Connections and Bridging Divides. Hosting this event is Professor Mara Kolesas, and I'll go ahead and let her introduce our guest speaker for today.
Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure today to have this conversatory with Professor Jeff Cohen. He is the James March Professor of Organizational Studies in Education and Business, Professor of Psychology, and also Professor of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. He's also a faculty affiliate of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. His research, you must have read, examines the process that shapes people's sense of belonging and self-concept, and also the role that these processes play in various social problems, for example, related to school, work, healthcare, policing as well. And he provides not only the theory, but also the science-backed strategies to address these issues. This means that he goes by, as far as I heard, with Kurt Lewin, the founder of social psychology. There is nothing as practical as a good theory. And as a theorist turned practitioner, I couldn't agree more. But what most speaks to me of his work in these turbulent times is his very unusual but highly necessary combination that his work brings us humanism meets social democracy, meets social critique, meets Aristotle practice in small things, meets agency, meets optimism. Welcome to the conversatory, Jeff Cohen.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
So you must have had this question as you have been touring with your new book, Belonging. I don't know whether it can be seen. Why and how did you start working on these issues? Is it at all related to your own experience of belonging or not belonging?
Well, I was really fortunate to serendipitously work with a mentor of mine named Claude Steele, who was very influential in the direction of, as you may know, Claude Steele had studied for a long time the psychology of what it is like to marginalized individuals, especially a big influence on me was his mentorship and my exposure to graduate school. Then, in addition to that research influence, I think, the more I think about it, the more I think that that sense of not quite feeling like you fully belong is ironically one of the things that unites us as human beings. We've kind of all been there. We all know what it feels like to be in a situation or in an institution or in a social setting where, for one reason or another, we're feeling a bit like outsiders. And often it takes a form not of a certainty, but an uncertainty. You're just kind of wondering, are people accepting of me? Do they respect me? Do they see me? And that uncertainty, I think we all know, is really highly aversive because as a social species, we've evolved to go through life together, and we're pretty helpless alone, at least evolutionarily speaking. So I had my own sort of bouts and personal experiences with not quite feeling fully like I belong. And I think that is a kind of human universal, ironically. So I would say it was those two influences, both personal and professional.
Wonderful. And so how would you define belonging, and elaborating of what you just said, why it is important? It is not only to be part of a group and just have fun with a group. It goes way deeper than that.
Yeah, that's right. It is that sense that you are seen as someone who matters in the group, and it's a two-way street. I'm ironically here at an academic conference in social psychology, and I think belonging issues are pretty salient for a lot of people here. You're wondering, am I seen as someone who belongs as a social psychologist? And I certainly felt like that myself many times throughout my career. And then you're also wondering, do I even want to belong here? Are these people people that I feel like I can count on and that I can trust? So it is belonging is kind of a two-way street. It's not, as you say, just having fun. It's that sense of being socially significant, significant to the group, and the group being significant to you. And that is, when it happens, when you really do have that feeling of belonging, it is a very magical experience. I think we all kind of know that sense. And I think a lot about the concept of home as a less of a brick and mortar place, but a kind of psychological state where you're it's a feeling. I feel at home here, and a lot of that is that sense that I can be and express who I am, free of judgment, and feeling like I'm accepted.
Yeah, yeah, kind of an anchor of the self in
Yeah,
relationship with others. We have heard a lot, not only these days, but in these last years, that belonging is in peril or in trial, right? And if I am quoting you correctly, you mentioned the phrase that Pete Buttigieg mentions, that we are in this crisis of belonging. And it's very interesting to me because it becomes a crisis when those who have always belonged feel doubts about their belonging, while at the very inception of this country, there were those who did not belong, and
yeah.
which is still the case in many ways, besides the legal advances in rights. Which takes me to the question, why now? How the US became so divided, this crisis of civic and communal experience?
Why now? The answer to that question is because in this era, one defining feature of this era is that few people feel certain of their belonging in their country or in their society, and often in their community. That is, I would say, the defining era of our age is an uncertainty about what is home and where is my home, and the place that I had seen as home no longer feels recognizable to me. And that was the term that Pete Buttigieg put he had his finger on the pulse when he had that term. He called it a crisis of belonging that our country is going through. But I think it also applies to much of the wider world, where people don't really have same stable sources of belonging that they used to in many parts of the world. In the United States, that sense of what my country is for many is no longer a stable source of self-identity the way it was. It's a feeling, it's a psychology that many people have. And also our connections to work because of the pandemic, but also because of changes in the nature of employment in our country, have made it harder to have that place where we feel like we can go to work every day and it's a reliable place of employment that values us and won't lay us off next week. Likewise, our politics are incredibly divisive because of largely, I think, the politicians and the media and social media creating divisions among us, stoking up fear that makes us all feel like strangers, to borrow a term, strangers in our own land, to borrow a term from sociologist Ari Huxfield. So I think a lot of forces converge at this moment to create a crisis of belonging where so few of us feel at home. We did a study where we were just inquiring at an institution of higher learning as to which group experiences the most uncertainty about belonging on campus. And the two groups that experienced the most uncertainty about belonging on campus were Black women and white conservative men. Now, seemingly very different, disparate groups, but they did share a feeling. They both felt like outsiders.
Well, that's, yeah. and this goes to my question about polarization. You mentioned, I mean, the bandits and the leader in this article you wrote, I think it was to 20 behavioral science, I don't remember, about party over politics.
Yeah.
And this, I mean, speaks to alliances, needs of belonging, and at the same time, a perpetuation of political polarization that has nothing to do with cognition, right? But with how I recognize myself and how I anchor myself. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, this was back in 2002, even before. And before we were as divided as we are now politically as a country, I wanted to know in this research, how important is it when we're forming a position on a social policy such as welfare policy? How important are the facts of the matter, the facts of the issue, the details of the policy, versus the position of our political party? And if belonging trumps political facts, we would expect that the urge to conform to the judgments of our political tribe would compete favorably with the effect of the details of the social policy that's at stake. And so we designed a study in which we pitted these two influences against one another. To make a long story short, we found that party trumps policy. So that is to say, no matter what the content of the policy was, very, very generous or very, very, let's say, stringent, lean in its benefits, no matter what the details of the policy, both Democrats and Republicans alike went along with the ostensible position of their party. So if Democrats were said to really support this policy, Democratic lawmakers, Democratic respondents said, yeah, I love this policy. Likewise, for Republicans, if Republican congressmen said, or congresspeople said, we really like this generous policy, they're like, yeah, I like it too. And the ability of the mind to rationalize a position, to rationalize holding the position of one's group, no matter what that position is what is illustrated in that study. Now, of course, it makes sense to trust our groups, but then you kind of get to this question of, well, if the two parties can't even agree on the best policy that their party has to offer when it's espoused by the other side, what in the world are we going to end up agreeing on? And so that was an early demonstration 2 decades ago of the power of party to override our logical faculties, and also the power of rationalization to blind us to our own conformity. This is work by Emily Cronin, Princeton, who shows that pretty much when we form our judgments to our party or any group, we're kind of blind to the influence because we kind of rationalize it to kind of find a way to look at the world in which the judgments of our group make some sense. And that's what we found, that even though people dramatically conform to their party, they denied having, even when we probe them anonymously. So the group is stealthy. It's like a sort of double agent that kind of goes undercover in our heads and makes us think things that we wouldn't have otherwise thought, and we don't even realize it.
I really like that figure, right? Like a double agent in your head. And to that point, I mean, this sense of belonging, it seems to be in tension, right? Because on the one hand, we needed to anchor ourselves and to feel part of something bigger as human beings, kind of part of the human condition. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that that group is going to be necessarily good, and people have done horrible things, because they are part of groups, kind of like eros and thanatos, right? Like
Eros and thanatos.
Clashing. Yeah, eros and thanatos clashing there, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yes, heart and mind, love and death, right? And I think that does happen. Our groups can lead us to do some awful things. We, in individuals to countries, look at conformity to the group as a bad thing, right? But On the other hand, the way I think of it is that conformity is both an asset and a liability. It's a kind of facet of human nature. We co-form experience, form together experience, and that's just human nature. But the kind of greatest human triumphs and human evils are cut from the same cloth. We end up building magical things together, doing incredible things together, as a family, as a community, right? As a company, corporation, as a business. We exploit the group for these wonderful outcomes, but at the same time, groups by many of the same mechanisms can lead us astray. And I recall one former student who described how he had found himself working in a cigarette ad company. He was a kind of writing ads for Philip Morris, a cigarette company. And he was in the midst of it, working as hard as he could, applying all psychological expertise to write a great advertisement for this job he had. He was part of a group, this company. And then all of a sudden, it's almost like as he describes it, he woke up. He's like, wait a minute, what am I doing? It's like, I'm actually assisting, aiding and abetting in evil. And he's like, at that moment, well, not quite at that moment, but over a series of decisions, he left. But experience captures how we can be lured into doing things that we wouldn't otherwise do. And that's actually a story by Michael Jolet of a big musician in now he quit being an advertising executive to become a rock star.
Not bad. And I was going to ask you about, not conforming to your tribe, but you just mentioned it. There's a high cost and high cost that is exemplified, by, for example, Unorthodox, the series that, went around what is the cost, even though it's pretty much a fairy tale, but I'm gonna leave the addressing of that just completely to the side. But this means that, where we are and what we have around is really powerful, right? It reminds me of the Milgram experiment about, I think it was electric shock, if I remember correctly, but also about, Arendt describing Eichmann, that he was in this machine and he was, a cog on this machine. And this brings to the front the power of the situation, which is one of your main arguments, not only to explain, but also to intervene or craft, as you put it. Would you speak to that?
Yeah, so much for putting that so well. There's so much in that question. It's hard to decide which way to go, but let's put it this way. A lot of people thought that there was something inherently wrong with the culture of Nazi Germany, for it to have committed the atrocities it did. And a lot of early social science was exploring the nature of German culture and German character as a likely explanation. And actually, a lot of social psychologists were hypothesizing that something in the German culture made it more conformist. That turned out not to be true. What instead seems to be the case, as one of the founders of our field, a brilliant man named Kurt Lewin, argued, was that Germany was entangled in a sophisticated and well-crafted system of brutality. That is, the Nazis, Hitler, Goebbels, and the henchmen, they created an intricate they changed the situation of daily human life in such a way that awful things became tolerable and accepted. So that included, of course, propaganda and these little mortifications that were committed on Jews, such as closing down their stores initially. It also included Nazi youth groups that began, I think, around age 7 and continued throughout development. So the Nazis crafted an intricate and brutal, and of course there was fear, brutal system of intimidation and socialization to accomplish their ends. And that was the lesson that Kurt Lewin was really thinking of when he created the field of social psychology, which is a field dedicated to understanding the power of the situation. And that's, as my friend or former mentor Lee Ross puts it, the power of the situation. That is what our field is all about. We think people act in the ways they do because of who they are, their character, their abilities, but often we neglect the powerful impact of the situations that they're contending with, both for good and for ill. And oftentimes, I don't know if you found this in your life, but I found this in my life, that when someone does something that I find objectionable or hurtful, I often jump to the conclusion that, God, they have less character than I thought. And I find myself reflexively going there. And then later, when I inquire with them about, hey, what was going on, there's often a backstory that I wasn't aware of, something going on in the situation of their life that helped shed light on why they were acting as they did. So I think we all experience this, but we tend to be a bit uncharitable, especially when judging others' objectionable behavior. We lack empathy. We don't consider as much as we should the situations that people are going through and contending with at work, at school, in their family, and how those can explain their behavior. And one of the most powerful situations that there is the situation of feeling as though you're not fully accepted. And so, by contrast, one of the best situations is the situation that you create where all people truly feel they belong.
So that's great, because it leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask before saying that, this, as we have said, this situation overpowers morals, right? As you just mentioned, even though morals has a wide semantic range, but also what it does is decenters the explanation from these innate, characteristics, giving more leeway to the human being. You mentioned when we do not know when we belong, and you coined the term belonging uncertainty. That really speaks to me and really spoke to me, because my life is a continuous, belonging uncertainties never fit quite right in any individually, psychologically, but also socially and politically, under dictatorship, etc., etc. I didn't mean to do this whole thing about me, but it really speaks to me. So I would love you to share this concept, with the audience, with all our students, and also what it entails when it's, this chronic experience, right, that we may not be aware of, right? It's kind of, it takes a toll on our psychological economy, so to speak. It's a psychological economy that goes bankrupt in a way.
It was so well said. Exactly. Yeah. I thank you for sharing all that. That really conveys very well the experience. Belonging uncertainty is a term that a brilliant collaborator of mine, Greg Walton, I came up with again, probably 15 years ago, to describe that state of mind where literally you're uncertain of your belonging. You don't quite know, and you're kind of teetering. It's like, do I or do I not? And that captures this kind of intuition, I think, that many of us have, that what's really draining is to not know. Like, it's okay. If I know people really don't like me, I just steer clear. But like, what's really toxic is really wanting to belong in a group or be a part of a profession or be part of the country, but just always getting these kind of conflicting messages. And so belonging uncertainty describes that state where you're just wondering, you're uncertain of your belonging. I experienced it in a very limited way. Professor, but I think we all experience it in any situation where we don't know what the other person thinks of us. It could be at work, or, with a boss. But I experienced it when I was a first-year professor. At the end of the day, I would notice that I'd come home completely exhausted. In fact, wow, what made me exhausted? And it got a lot of work done. I'd look back on the day, I'd be like, I almost got nothing done. It was that I was ruminating. I was ruminating over the social events of the day. Like, my chair would would pat me on the back, I'd remember at the end of the day, and he would ask me how my class was going. And I would think, oh, maybe he heard something bad about my class. And I would think that both at the time, but then kind of replay it in my mind. There were just a lot of little things, partly because of my own vulnerability as a first year transitioning professor, going to this place with the grand poobahs of social psychology, just kind of wondering if I belong, partly because the place is a bit of an elitist place. That just made me a little uncertain, made me uncertain of whether I belonged. And it took up a lot of mental energy. So there were the two psychological effects are rumination, this kind of precious mental energy gets depleted. Your bank account is used up, as you put, like all that time and energy that I could have been using for work or my family got taken up with these like wasted concerns because it really didn't lead to much. And then second, in this state of mind, little things loom large. So that chair patted me on the back. That was a little thing, but it kind of loomed large. It's like evidence that I didn't belong. So in the state of mind, little things can loom large. It's as if your belonging is continually on trial. Now, I, being a white male in this situation, for me, that was like that was a transitional phase. But there are many people, tragically throughout our country and community, throughout the world, who are dealing with that throughout their lives, throughout their entire profession, throughout their whole tenure at school. And what damage can that do? And that's one of the inquiries that Greg and I launched. And the answer is that it can do quite a bit of damage, really impede people's ability to achieve their potential.
Yes, and this makes me think about another concept, but I want to highlight what you just said. Those who by default at some point know that they're going to belong, and those who have been systematically excluded and therefore, feel they don't belong. And also they deal, or we deal, I want to put myself out of the equation, but not only with the uncertainty of belonging, but also with what Claude Steele, your mentor, coined as stereotype threat. And can you please explain what that is? Because it's really powerful.
Really powerful. Claude, with Josh Aronson and Steve Spencer, was thinking that one of the consequences of being a marginalized group is that in situations where the stereotype is might apply, you're a bit preoccupied. So for a Black student taking a standardized test, stereotype threat takes the form of knowing that if I do poorly on this exam, the other people observing my performance may interpret it as confirmation of the stereotype. And a lot, I experienced this as a Jewish person, an academic, going back home with my friends who are non-academics. We all experience stereotype threat. It occurs when we know that our behavior could be seen as a negative reflection on our group, and it causes preoccupation, anxiety, stress, and just our attention is divided. So now for that Black student taking that test, my attention is divided between focusing on the test versus thinking about the stereotype and the implications if I do badly. So that extra preoccupation can harm performance under two key conditions. One is in the situation where the test is very difficult, when you're performing at the frontiers of your ability, that's when you start to wonder, oh, geez, I am having trouble here. And that may lead me to do poorly, which in turn may confirm the stereotype. So it's at that edge where we're kind of working at the limits of our ability that stereotype threat undermines performance. And when we're identified with the domain, we really want to do well. I really want to do well in this test. So it's almost like choking under pressure. In order to choke, you have to want to do well. So under those two key conditions, Claude and Josh, Steve, and many, many subsequent investigators have shown that people really fall short of their potential performance. They can't show what they know. And in some studies, it even leads to an increase in the race gap, a dramatic increase in the race gap. So in the original stereotype threat studies, for example, blacks and whites performed relatively equally when the test was just the same standardized test was just described as some puzzles have nothing to do with intellectual performance, and kind of equating them statistically for their prior ability by covariating out their SAT performance. They were, but when the test was suddenly framed as diagnostic of your ability, then this huge racial gap in performance opened up. And that's the nature of stereotype threat. It is an invisible aspect of the situation. It is a subjective part of the situation people are in that we often can't see when it's the other person. And it ends up making the standardized test, the workplace, the classroom different, psychologically different for different people, and far from an equal playing field.
Yeah, this is which brings me to think about when I came, to this country, and I was, because clearly because of my accent, I'm an immigrant foreigner, but that white people don't get it. And it took me a long time, because it was not a cognitive issue, right? It is like this weight that is just permanent, where you have to either prove yourself or know what you are. And this is what you are describing with belonging and uncertainty, but also with stereotype threat. And on top of that, not to throw concepts around, but stereotype groups in whatever context or whatever nature also get a lot of attributions, right? And I think it was Lee Ross who coined the term, the fundamental attribution error.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Would you explain also in what it is and how it relates actually to belonging?
The fundamental attribution error refers to our tendency to overestimate the importance of dispositions or personality, internal features of the person, when we try to explain or predict behavior. And that's it. That's it. It refers to the fact that we judge, quick to go from observable behavior to assuming that there's some underlying essence there. And the way I think of it is like in Western countries, especially where the fundamental attribution error is very strong, it's like we're a little superstitious. We're a little superstitious. We think that, oh, this person shy, that means there's some ghost in the machine, some essence of shyness that made them behave that way. And they're probably shy in all kinds of circumstances, at home, at work, everywhere, because that's their essence. What Lee showed, synthesizing a large body of research, was that inference, when we're so quick to go from behavior to disposition, is often erroneous. And for that reason, we underestimate the importance of the situation. Like, this person was shy because maybe there was someone in their situation, someone there that they felt a little uncomfortable with, or and then we overestimate the extent to which their behavior is generalizable across different situations. It turns out people are very, very different in different situations. Personality is not nearly as consistent as a stable trait as we seem to think it is. And so that was Lee's lesson. Now, why is that important for belonging? That's important for belonging because if we're quick to judge, we often don't give people a chance to belong. We write them off. Some very nice research by Jason Okanafua, Jennifer Eberhardt, and Greg Walton, and others shows how, for example, teachers are quick to commit the fundamental attribution error with Black kids. If a Black kid misbehaves in class twice, they're like, well, 2 strikes and you're out. And I bet you're a troublemaker. Maybe we should consider suspension. They don't do that as much with a white kid. So these errors, these kind of frailties of mind, contribute to the crisis of belonging for sure. And this all goes back to, Psalms, right? Matthew, take not the little speck of dust from your enemy's eye. Instead, remove the huge plank of wood from your own eye. We're very, very quick to judge, and the fundamental attribution error reflects that. It's a real big contributor to the crisis of belonging, I believe. And if we all stop doing it a little bit, that would help a lot.
Yes, and to that point, you do science-based social psychology with the intention of applying it to practice. So in this situation, crafting and the wise interventions that you mentioned, if you can explain, there are ways to mitigate that belonging uncertainty or that fundamental attribution error. Would you explain what you mean by situation crafting and what wise interventions are?
So the opposite of a great truth is also true. The situation is powerful, what social psychology shows. However, the individual is also powerful. How is the individual powerful? It's not through the direct route. An individual can be powerful by changing the situation that they're in. We are all, each of us, part of every single situation we're in, by definition. I know it sounds obvious, but it's actually pretty profound. That means by the words we choose, by the things we do, we can change the situation in sometimes really powerful ways. For the worse, unfortunately, but also for the better. And so situation crafting captures the craft of doing this. It's a mindset and a skill set. It is a mindset and skill set, a craft of creating situations that bring out our individual and collective best. And that's all. One good example of this, just to use a quick one, is Lee and Steve Samuels and others did a nice little study where they looked at competition or cooperation in one of these competitive economic games. Like, do you cooperate with another player and share a pot of money, or do you defect from the other player and try to take the whole pot for yourself? People think that personality is going to matter a lot in predicting who defects and who cooperates. It turns out, at least in that study, how it's measured, it doesn't really. But what does matter is a single couple of words, how the experimenter describes the game. When the experimenter calls it the Wall Street game, 70% of people defect. When the experimenter just refers to it offhandedly as the community game, it fully reverses. Now 70% of the players cooperate. The name of the game changes the game, and thereby behavior. And I love this study because it kind of sends the optimism that, hey, maybe we can kind of turn situations into little community games all the time. Of course, it's more challenging than that, right? Because I might define this thing as a community game, you might define it as a Wall Street game, and not so much later that you're defining all this, but kind of a big kernel of hope in there in that little study about the power we all have to change the situations we're in.
Yeah, I love that the name of the game changes just the game. And two lines that I understood that go through your book. One is that your book itself is a wise criticism on just the most common ways of policies and programs that have been tried to mitigate education gaps. I was very involved with education, policy education, and political activism for the schools. No changes, and doing the same won't do. They have like a wrong understanding of humans, as you said. And the other is this: we do have agency, right? We do have agency kind of to act, to set in motion open-ended possibilities. Arendt would say that. And key, as you said, with the name of the game changes the game, is language. So not saying this is the way it is, but I think this is the way it is, or I have high standards. And these words shape the social world. I want to ask you now a particular question, maybe a self-indulging. From what I read, I heard from you, and even in this conversation, you do not use words such as othering, psychological safety, ally, that's a word that I have strong normative reaction against. And I would like to know why, basically, because it seems to be consistent, this not use of these words, where they're involved, let's say, in the field.
Well, I very hard to make the writing accessible, even though we're dealing with science, a lot of scientific ideas and concepts. And so for that reason, I tried very hard to minimize unfamiliar, what some people might construe as jargon. And in fact, at one point we had the word, it wasn't otherizing, it was it actually was otherizing. And the editors asked us to take it out, and I did. And for that, but I still tried to kind of capture the concept. But it, to me, the concept or the idea is what's important. Otherizing, referring to these little things that we do all the time to undercut people's sense of being included, being part of. But it's a fair, I mean, some people may take issue with that. If so, that's a fair criticism. But I really try to honor the ideas and to avoid some of what people might find as kind of off-putting jargon.
Yes, thank you for that. I understood it in the sense that, negative words also create our social world. And if we say you need to feel psychological safety, you're preparing people against threats, as opposed to say psychological comfort that brings you to kind of a better attitude.
Yeah, psychological safety once or twice, but it is that is a term that I think is actually pretty good too. Psychological safety, that sense that I can be and express myself in the situation fully without being included. And I do like that Amy Edmondson concept too.
Yeah. I can ask at some other point, the difference with psychological comfort, but I'm not going to self-indulge here because I know that you have another commitment, and I want to honor questions from our audience. So I wanted to ask you, just to wrap up.
Oh, sure.
What would you say about, takeaways before we go to the questions that are being poured into the chat? What are the takeaways that you want to share with us?
The takeaways would be the power of the situation as a support for belonging and a potential barrier, so that situation is as powerful. And number two is our ability to craft or create situations that we're in. And of course, we have kind of some limited room to maneuver depending on the situation, but we have some room to maneuver. And just to give a few more examples of this beyond the Wall Street community game, one of the motives for doing a lot of the work and the research that I do is to try to not only identify problems, but give people tools to solve them. And so there's so much work out there on practical ways in which we can change situations we're in for the better. And you already mentioned a few. One is just when we give our political opinions, saying, I think, or from my perspective, especially when we're having conversations across the divide. Work by Michael Schwabe at Stanford shows that when we just put our opinions with using these sort of opinion frames, just kind of making it clear that this is our subjective point of view, the other side is much more open to listening, finding out more, and even moving a bit more in our direction. Another example is what is known as wise criticism. So in a lot of cases, we're trying to give good critical feedback, but sometimes that criticism could be misunderstood, especially in a diverse situation, like when a white teacher or a white manager is giving feedback to a Black student or a Black minority, as is often the case in today's social reality of in the United States today. Wise criticism refers to communicating the criticism as an expression of your high standards and belief in the person's potential. So with Claude Steele and others, we did several studies. I'll just describe one where we just had teachers give feedback in that way to their ethnic minority students in 7th grade. And we found that when ethnic minority students got criticism, with the teacher stating explicitly, I'm giving you this criticism because I believe in your ability to reach a higher standard. When the Black kids got the feedback that way, 71% revised their essay, revised their work, compared with only 17% in a control group who just received the criticism. Not only that, years later, those kids were more likely to make it to college as a result of getting that sort of message of belief in them at a key formative stage. So those are just two examples of many. Maybe we could go into more in the Q&A of ways in which we can all change situations for the better. Nothing is a quick fix, nothing is a recipe, but I'm presenting mindsets and tools for making situations at least a little bit better. And that's the kind of philosophy that I really believe in, is that, we're not going to be able to always turn around a situation. That once in a while, we always make it a little bit better if we're looking at the right mindset and tools.
Yes, and also together with social policy, right? Because this has, an aggregate effect.
And I definitely really want to echo that excellent point that systemic changes in social policy are absolutely necessary in this effort to address the crisis of belonging. Better work conditions, better enforcement of laws, and promote fairness and inclusion. Of course, all those things are so important. What I'm talking about is the day-to-day, lap, moment to moment. What can you do given the cards that you're dealt in a situation to make it a little bit better? But that is not to undercut anything about systemic change. And in fact, a lot of these little moves and tools and mindsets that promote belonging, they work very, very well in a system of true equity. They seem to work better because it's the combination of feeling like I belong and having true, genuine opportunity that catalyzes success. Neither one alone is sufficient.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's another conversation there about what inclusion is, what belonging, how one drives the other, that I'm not going to self-indulge. I wanted to give you, before give the floor or the screen to people, these cartoon, this vignette that I shared with you, and I've been using it for a long time, is by an Argentine cartoonist, Tute. And I like it because your book has that concept, but only when you are kind of shielded, right, from this psychological uncertainty, is it when you can actually shower water and make other things grow. And that's what you bring. And thank you for that. And I'm gonna go, if you want to read the questions yourself.
No, you better pick them. Why don't you pick them out? Because I'm unfortunately, just because of practical constraints, on a small screen. So please feel free to pick them out.
Okay, so I am going to take Wendy's question. And Wendy's, so great to meet you here after so long. Wendy says, curious how you think the US culture of individualism impacts belonging. Well, Wendy, that was one of my indulging questions, so I'm happy you are asking. It could lower belonging uncertainty or the expectation we should all belong to a group, but instead we are in a belonging crisis.
Yes, that's a good point. I would say individualism. I would have said up front that individualistic countries should have lower rates or higher rates of loneliness and higher rates of a lack of belonging than collectivist cultures. That doesn't seem to actually be the case as much as you would think. But that said, I do think individualism, though it has many assets, also has some liabilities in it and contributes to the belonging crises in at least two ways. First, it makes us very judgmental, right? We think we have this sort of titanic individualism that ascribes bad outcomes to bad actors. And that's a real problem when we're trying to solve problems, because oftentimes what ends up happening is we make the problem worse by making the actors feel even less like they belong, by punishing them or castigating them. So the fundamental error tends to be stronger in individualistic cultures. That's one way in which individualism, I think, partly fuels the crisis of belonging. And of course, that relates to policy and our willingness to create policies that address social equities, more individualistic ideologies, kind of put a brake on the enthusiasm for those policies, unfortunately. And then number two is individualism. It deceives it fools us into thinking that things will make us happy that actually don't. We in this society today really get it wrong. These are called affective forecasting errors by Dan Gilbert and Tim Wilson. We get it wrong. We think that what makes us happy are these things that we put on our resume, like our accomplishments and our achievements and being financially well off. And whilst they do matter, what matters a lot more is the quality of our connections, the qualities of our relationships. Those matter a lot more. And cultivating those is so essential to our well-being. I think individualism blinds us to the importance of these things that aren't on our resume, but are, as David Brooks has said, on our obituary. Are you a good person?
Wow.
Do you? And those are called eudaimonic well-being that really genuinely stick with us and make us happy in an enduring way. And I'm so disturbed by like these young college students where they find that, I think back in the 50s, doing good and having a family were the number one rated objectives or values of college undergraduates, college first-year students. In 2012, the number one objective or value was being economically very well off. Now, of course, going to college and being able to support for your family, very, very important. But for that value to kind of beat out the importance of doing good, might not just be bad for the individuals and their health, but for society. And I think in those two ways, individualism has some toxins in it that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's part that goes, part of my belonging uncertainty when I'm like, yeah, we'll meet. But I remember like an anecdote, and I'm gonna jump. I was in Morocco like a long time ago, and I happened to meet Moroccans, and we were invited. I was invited to their place, and we were cooking this tagine and eating this tagine in a very poor kind of construction with the open. It didn't have like a ceiling, and it was freezing because it was winter. And one of the Moroccans was there visiting, but was living in Holland, right? And he was having a very good passing, right? Earning well. And the Moroccans in Morocco were feeling bad for him because he didn't have his friends and he was alone. And that stayed with me, and it was you primed it basically. It was in the back, and it speaks to, they were living like it didn't have a ceiling where we were having dinner, and it was freezing. There was no heating, and still they were feeling bad for this member who was poor thing living in Holland, and he was alone. So
much for sharing. Really beautifully captures it. Beautifully captures some of the cultural differences. To be able to that's kind of a collectivist psychology to think about.
Yeah. You also mentioned at some point in one talk, Madrid, and at the culture that they're all there, and in Rome as well. It's like, where are we gonna meet? When? What do you mean? We go down to the piazza every day, and we all meet there, and that's how it is.
I was years ago, but just trying to capture this. But I think that is true. When I was in Spain, it's true. People just kind of they look for these, I think it's called sober mesa, these opportunities to be around the table together. And since after work, that's what you do. You go to the plaza and hang out with people, have a cafe. And America is quite different. It's a more, it doesn't, we don't do that as much here.
No, I mean, the word that you use, sobremesa, is a word that I try to teach everyone because they take the place immediately. And I love that experience. I'm going to honor the questions and your time. Nora agrees with Wendy's question that the US was founded on individualism and not the sense of community. Douglas is asking, is not otherizing a natural tribal act coming from our evolved hyper alertness to dangers of those not in our tribe, so that instead thinking that designating people as others as wrong, since it is naturally to us to seek how to ease the fear that triggers it.
Yeah, I mean, just to address that's a good point. There does seem to be some evolutionary evidence that we are quick to negatively condition on outgroups, and this is correctly by Liz Spelks at NYU, showing that we condition just readily to outgroups, unfamiliar outgroups, as we do to spiders and snakes, things that we've kind of evolved to really be alert to. So that does seem to suggest that we are kind of alert to, we want to know, is it friend or foe? And we all know, I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of Walking Dead, great TV show. And one of the lessons that show is, it's not the dead you have to worry about, it's other human beings. And so that's like a fundamental question that we're always asking, is this friend or foe? So it makes sense to be on the alert. And a lot of the interventions that have been developed in social psychology, changes in the situation, calling this a community game, having people work together across group divides in pursuit of common goals, listening to stories, reconciliation, and so much more, are all about creating situations in which I can trust that this is a friend rather than a foe.
Mm-hmm. And there was also physical evidence that light up the brain, I think, when someone feels ostracized, and that brings you to a primary state of, alert. Is that?
That's true. Yeah, loneliness is one of the, when your brain says, I'm speaking, I am alone, that's really bad for your body, over the long term. In the short term, it could be a good thing. Like, when we've evolved so that when our central nervous system alerts us that I'm feeling lonely here, then we go into this sort of get ready to be potentially wounded mode, sort of fight or flight. Because, yeah, without other people around, we are really vulnerable to predation and highly, highly edible. So get ready. And it's been shown by John Cacioppo, his research on loneliness, that this is what happens. There's a kind of cascade of physiological reactions that is sort of like a fight or flight or threat response, in which, you're just ready. I'm just ready for trouble. And it makes a lot of sense, because if you're going to be wounded, you want that inflammation, that inflammatory response to be kicking in. The problem is that in our modern society, that most of the threats that we experience, not all, but most, don't involve physical harm. So that kind of threat response isn't really very helpful. It can actually undermine our ability to perform under pressure. And the second source of the problem is that when that threat response is chronically, repeatedly active over the long term, as it is for people who are chronically lonely, about 1/5 of our population now, it is a major driver of morbidity and mortality. It is essentially like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or being an alcoholic. It leads to a lot of cardiovascular disease and early death. And so loneliness is a social disease. It's like a disease. Disease is probably the wrong term, but it is as lethal as a disease.
Yes, it reminds me also, I'm overquoting, over referring to Arendt, but actually Arendt talks about the experience of belonging as one of the most radical not in terms of politics, but, as devastating, that a man, she spoke, as man and not women, can endure. And not an individual level, but as also a collective experience. She put that loneliness in the figure of the stateless, right? And first of all, the lonely is fertile ground for totalitarianism, right? And the second point is that this loneliness is what the stateless person feels.
Yeah.
Basically, that he, she, they do not belong to the world. And this
then,
is where, the right to have rights kicks in. But in a way, is like the right to belong, right?
Freedom from fear too, as Roosevelt put it. The right to fear.
So let me see.
But to add to the hopeful message is that that sense of being lonely is it's a psychological state. It's a psychological state. You can be physically with people and still feel lonely. You can feel you can be all by yourself and still feel connected. And so there's research now showing just how you can create that connection with other people just through having purpose, having some higher purpose that you devote yourself to. It could be a project, a book, or a volunteer group. Volunteerism is really healthy for adolescents and older people and everyone alike. Giving turns out, having a purpose turns out to be one antidote to loneliness.
You mentioned connection, and you mentioned connection a lot. Is connection enough for belonging? Because sometimes it may be transitory, superfluous, and may not sediment, right, in this experience.
Yeah, I think that's right. The best connection is when you can kind of trust it will continue. And when you can't trust that it will continue, that it leads to what you might call a sort of insecure attachment, where you're wondering, maybe you're avoidant. It could lead to avoidant attachment, where it's like, okay, I feel a little connected, but I don't really trust that it will continue, that this person will be in my corner. And that kind of attachment, where it's like more transitory, isn't as powerful as the kind that is more enduring. And I think you really kind of capture that in your point.
Yeah, I like that a connection is enduring. I have a last question, and I know you have a pending, and I don't have more questions in the chat. So I think I just forgot the question that I was going to ask. It escaped me. It was about loneliness and statelessness. Oh, yes. So in this situation, crafting and conflict and divides, are there elements in these insights and arguments that you bring to help address ethnic conflicts? I know this is a big question, but I'm wondering whether this could be extrapolated to the social political as well. And I don't know, I'm thinking, needless to say, Middle East, but not only, right? It's not only Israel, Palestine, it's just Turkey, Kurdistan, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, against the backdrop of these huge conflicts in the world, like what's happening in the Middle East now and elsewhere, it's like there's not much I can say that's going to sound realistic, but there is for hope in our day-to-day encounters. And bit by bit, by doing these things, we'll get there, I think, along with the efforts of people in government and leaders to create peace. So I just want to sort of really just acknowledge the problem and how vast it is. Yet there are these little sort of grassroots of hope out there. And I'll just give two examples. One is some lovely work by Elizabeth Pollack, who showed in the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda that a radio show opera that modeled reconciliation between two villages reduced tension and promoted trust between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And it's a wonderful paper. I don't want to kind of make it seem like a radio soap opera would solve the problems. No, but it had, among the respondents and the participants in the study, it had this significant effect on trust and openness to communication with the other side. And this is the power of stories, right? Philip Pullman, the author, writes, he's famous for the saying, thou shalt speaks to the head, but once upon a time speaks to the heart. And so the power of stories to open our minds to possibilities for peace, that's one thing that was leveraged in that work that promoted togetherness across a bruising history. The second example is some really lovely work, again, or some powerful work by Salma Musa, who demonstrated that integrated sports these were football teams in Iraq, brought Muslims and Christians together. And so she created these integrated sports teams where Muslims and Christians played together in the league. And she found that compared to non-integrated teams, the integrated teams, there was much more intergroup harmony and much less prejudice between the two groups. And she describes these powerful stories in which team members would vouch for one another. She even had measures of this, like, nominate someone from the other group for recognition, for a reward, because they had played together. And what that work demonstrates isn't the power of stories, but the power of creating a story together in which we're struggling together to reach some superordinate goal, a goal that we can't get to alone. We need each other to get to it, to win the tournament. And if both sides do that together, that turns out the research is very clear that creating those superordinate goals really brings people together. And these are like little things that we can weave the fabric of our lives in little and big ways that will at least make the situation a little bit better. But in a lot of cases, it might make it a lot better and over for a long time.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned that. I didn't know that I made this this wise intervention, if that is what it is, but it was intentional. I was teaching in Lebanon and not in the country when, there was the Israel-Hezbollah war. And I went back to Lebanon after because I wanted to go back to teach. And in the class, I wanted to discuss the issues of the war. It's a very politicized country, and there was no way to break the group allegiance, right? Religious allegiance, right? The religious identity. So Christians were the Maronites and the Druze and the Shia and etc. and the Christian Orthodox. It was not working. So what I said, I invited the class and other classes that I had to my house, which is not very, absolutely not common there. And I said, I want to celebrate Lebanese food from all these, different traditions that you have. So you can come over and just share with me, like all the Lebanese traditions. Of course, I got a lot of yummy food, but that was not the goal. And they could talk then.
Yeah.
They could talk then. It's a sort of breaking bread, but they were connected in a different way.
People who eat together like each other.
Yes. So, they still send me recipes after, 15 years. So this is great. Any other question from our listeners? So if there are no more questions, this has been wonderful, Jeff. I wish we had more time to discuss these issues that you are beyond passionate about, and me too. So I hope we have other opportunities to get together and discuss. And thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for making the time. I know you're super busy, so I appreciate it. We all do.
And thank you to all the listeners. I wish I could meet each of you, but thank you for coming and for listening.
Thank you, Jeff. And thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.